Would you open your Bibles, please, to John 18? John 18. Yeah, I don't think the microphones are working this morning. And just a note in the back, I've got it on. It's green on the microphone, so something's going on in the back. It's not coordinated. But John 18, I'll speak loudly until it gets turned on. John 18, please. Oh, all right. John 18, we're going to be surveying John 18 and 19, those two chapters. We want to start with verse 33. John 18:33, therefore Pilate entered again into the praetorium and summoned Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" If you recall, when Jesus was born, the wise men called him the King of the Jews. He will be killed for that same title. I want us to appreciate the significance of that title, because there had been no King of the Jews for 600 years, since the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians. Ever since the fall in 586 BC, the Jews were ruled over by pagan Gentile kings. First the Babylonians, then the Medo-Persians, then the Greeks, and now in the time of Jesus, the Romans are in control under Tiberius Caesar as king. And when you look back throughout the history of the Jews, which we're about to cover in the next 2 quarters of our adult class, they hated that the Gentiles were kings over them. They hated the spiritual defilement that came with living in a land ruled by evil pagans. And in fact, there were a lot of Jewish revolts against those pagan powers. In fact, there were even Jewish revolts against Pontius Pilate, who was a Roman military governor working for King Caesar to keep the peace among the Jews, especially in Jerusalem. On one occasion, not recorded in the Bible, Pilate was in the holy city of Jerusalem, and he and his soldiers were traveling through, and they had these large flags or standards for Rome, and on the top of those flags were these little emblems, these little metal images of the emperor. And because Rome promoted emperor worship, the Jews took issue with that, because here were these pagans marching through the holy city of Jerusalem with graven images. So they asked Pilate to remove those images from the top of those flags, and Pilate refused. You see, the governors before Pilate were willing to compromise with the Jews, were willing to respect the religious scruples of the Jews in order to maintain peace, but Pilate did not care about their religious scruples at all. So the Jews followed him for days, protesting, until finally Pilate surrounded them with an army and threatened to kill them. And the Jews stuck their neck out, and they bared their necks before Pilate and said, "Go ahead and do it." And Pilate couldn't, because he knew there would have been chaos if he killed all those innocent Jews. Well, the Jews then reported Pilate to Caesar. Pilate was beaten as punishment, and Caesar told him to remove those images from those flags. On another occasion, not recorded in the Bible, the Jews needed a new water supply, and Pilate built an aqueduct for them, but he raided the treasury of the temple in order to pay for it. And you can imagine the Jews did not like that one bit. They were enraged, and they rioted in the streets. And so Pilate ordered his soldiers to dress up like Jews, disguise themselves in the mob, and launch a sneak attack, stabbing many of the Jews to death. On one occasion, mentioned in the Bible, Jesus mentions in Luke 13, in verse 1, how the Galilean Jews had their blood mixed with their sacrifices by Pilate. So it seems there was another instance of violence between Pilate and the Jews. My point in sharing all that is to help us see that Pilate hated the Jews, and the Jews hated Pilate. And when we come to John 18 and 19, really, it's more of a political wrestling match between Pilate and the Jews, and Jesus, the King of the Jews, was caught in the crossfire as if he didn't even matter, because neither the Jews nor Pilate recognized him as the king. Jesus, the unrecognized King of the Jews, is used here by Pilate as a pawn to humiliate the Jews, and Jesus let him do it. Now that we appreciate the hostility between the Jews and Pilate, you'll see it jump off the page. Look in verse 28, in John 18:28. And then they led Jesus from Caiaphas into the praetorium, and it was early, and they themselves did not enter into the praetorium, so that they would not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. The praetorium was the governor's residence. That's where Pilate lived and made his judgments. And right off the bat, we see the kind of people these Jews were. They're worried about entering this pagan residence and being defiled by that spiritually, but they're perfectly fine putting an innocent man to death. Continue, verse 29 and 30. Therefore Pilate went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" And they answered and said to him, "If this man were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him to you." Do you see the snarky attitude? The Jews are saying, "What kind of dumb question is that, Pilate? Do you really think we'd bring him to you if he wasn't guilty? We've already decided he's guilty, and it's your job to do our bidding." Well, listen to what Pilate says. 31 and 32, Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him according to your law." And the Jews said to him, "We're not permitted to put anyone to death, to fulfill the word of Jesus which he spoke, signifying by what kind of death he was about to die." I believe that this was a jab by Pilate in response to their attitude. The Jews treated Pilate like they had the power to decide people's fate, and Pilate was just their puppet. But by Pilate telling them, "Well, why don't you handle it on your own?" it reminded them who's really in power. It's not the Jews. It's the Romans. Because the Romans took away their power to enforce capital punishment. If that were in their power, they would have stoned Jesus to death. But the reason Jesus is crucified is because the Jews had no power. They were powerless to stone people to death. They had to appeal to the higher power in the land, the Romans, whom they hated, in order to have Jesus killed. And thus the prophecy of Jesus was fulfilled from John 12, that he would be lifted up to die. Well, we come back to that verse we started with in 33, "Are you the King of the Jews?" The reason the Jews brought Jesus up on the charge of claiming to be King of the Jews is because they knew that would get the Romans' attention. They didn't bring Jesus up on the charge that he claimed to be the Son of God because the Romans would not care enough about that to put him to death. But if they could say, well, he claims to be king, that would be viewed as a threat to Caesar. So sadly, we see this grand title, King of the Jews, used not as an official recognition of who Jesus really was, but as a manipulative political tactic for the Jews to get their way. Well, Jesus and Pilate have that famous conversation about the meaning of King of the Jews. What does that all mean? And Jesus assures him, "My kingdom is not of this world. It's a spiritual kingdom. Otherwise, my people would form an army and they'd fight for me." And Pilate finds no guilt in him, and Pilate actually now seeks to release him. That's Pilate's goal. Pilate's goal now is to release Jesus. Not only because he's innocent, but probably because it would rub the Jews the wrong way too. He wants to get Jesus off the hook. So, verse 39, Pilate says to them, "You have a custom that I release someone for you at the Passover. Do you wish then that I release for you the King of the Jews?" So they cried out again, saying, "Not this man, but Barabbas." And Barabbas was a robber. Pilate was hoping they'd choose Jesus. And he probably thought there'd be no way that they would choose Barabbas over Jesus. Barabbas was a robber. Mark's gospel tells us that he was an insurrectionist, someone who actually did rebel against the Roman king and government. So not only do they trade an innocent man for a guilty man, they show favor to a man who rebels against the Romans while they are simultaneously working with the Romans against Jesus. They're siding with the Roman government and rebelling against God's government. They are insurrectionists against God's king. They're making themselves out to be friends with Caesar because, hey, look, we've got Caesar's back. We're going to warn him. We're going to give a heads up. There's this guy, Jesus, he's claiming to be king. He's going to threaten Caesar. Their betrayal is so pathetic, so tragic. So Pilate has Jesus scourged, I believe, in part to get Jesus released. He has Jesus dressed up like a king with a purple robe and a crown of thorns, and the soldiers slap him in the face. And there's that title again. In John 19:3, they say, "Hail, King of the Jews." But once again, it's not used as an official recognition of who Jesus really was. It's used to mock and humiliate him. Then Pilate brings him out before the Jews, and he says, "Behold the man." In other words, does he really look like a king? Does he really look like a man capable of insurrection against the Romans? Haven't you had enough? But the Jews aren't buying it. They cry out, "Crucify him." Verse 12, John 19. As a result of this, Pilate made efforts to release him, but the Jews cried out, saying, "If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Everyone who makes himself out to be a king opposes Caesar." So the Jews who hated Caesar are now suddenly his friends. And they resort to blackmailing Pilate into doing what they want. Pilate had been in hot water before with the Caesar because of all his past troubles with the Jews. And now the Jews are essentially threatening to tell Caesar if Pilate releases Jesus. And Caesar won't like that. So now Pilate realizes he is trapped. There is nothing he can do. He's tried to release Jesus. He can't. Otherwise, he's sacrificing his own position before Rome. He's putting his own life at risk, essentially. Oh, he could have made the choice. But in his mind, he can't. In his mind, he's trapped. And so now he has a new goal: to mock and humiliate the Jews, and he uses Jesus to do it. Pilate brings Jesus out to them in verse 14 and says, "Behold your king." He was taunting them because he knew that would drive them crazy. They hated the idea of Jesus being their king, so Pilate calls him their king. And then when they shout, "Crucify him," he asks again, "Shall I crucify your king?" And again, that title, king, it's not used as an official recognition of who Jesus was. It was only a way to mock the Jews. And their response is chilling. At the end of verse 15, "We have no king but Caesar." The Jews are revolting against their true king Jesus, professing allegiance to a pagan king, something their people for centuries refused to do. They have completely sold themselves out. Pilate leads Jesus away to be crucified, and he has one last opportunity to mock and humiliate the Jews. You see, whenever someone was crucified, there would be a placard put on the cross with an inscription of the charge against them that led to their execution. And look at the charge Pilate wrote on Jesus' placard. Verse 19, Pilate also wrote an inscription and put it on the cross. And it was written, "Jesus the Nazarene, the King of the Jews." Therefore, many of the Jews read this inscription. For the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Hebrew, Latin, and in Greek. And of course, the Jews were not happy about this. They say, "Look, you need to change it. You need to write, 'He claimed to be King of the Jews.' You don't write, 'King of the Jews.'" Pilate wasn't having it. And he says in verse 22, "What I have written, I have written." It was Pilate's way of getting the last laugh against the Jews. Essentially, it was a way to mock their powerlessness. It was a way to say, "You all are so weak and so pathetic that this weak, beaten, defeated man is the only king you'll ever have." How ironic. He was exactly right. That was their king. Now, when we stand back and we look at the accounts in John 18 and 19, it's amazing to see. how none of them recognized Jesus as king, but God did. And God used the trial of Jesus to put the Jews and Pilate on trial, and all were found guilty. And then he used the hateful hearts of the Jews and of Pilate and the Roman soldiers to proclaim Jesus' kingship to the world. Pilate called Jesus the king publicly 3 times. The soldiers dressed Jesus up as king and said, "Hail, King of the Jews." And the Jews, in an effort to get Jesus killed, used the argument that he claimed to be the king of the Jews, which then led to Pilate putting that as the inscription over the cross in all 3 major languages of the world at that time, so that the entire world would see that Jesus was the king of the Jews. And then the Roman soldiers lifted him up on high on that cross for everyone to see, enthroned on that cross with a crown of thorns on his head. As we partake of the Lord's Supper this morning, we're saying to Jesus, we recognize you as the King of the Jews. You are my King. And I'm giving my life, bending my knee to you. Instead of saying we have no king but Caesar, we're saying we have no king but Jesus. You know, if I were there, I know I would not have understood. Nobody else did. Wouldn't be so arrogant as to think I would have gotten it. But I like to imagine what it would be like if I was there and I saw Jesus being dressed in that robe and crown of thorns on his head, beaten and mocked, and I could walk up to him and put my arm around him and say, "I see you. I recognize you. You are the King. You are my King." I wasn't there. We weren't there. But when we partake of the Lord's Supper, we can say that to him because we're eating at the King's table. We can say and recognize that he is the King who gave his body and his blood to save his people. We can hail and recognize the unrecognized King of the Jews. Let's hail the King of the Jews as we partake of this supper this morning.